Welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The Cairo heat pressed upon the terrace of Shepherd's Hotel like a living thing. Dense, golden, drowsy, with the scent of jasmine and cigarette smoke. It was February, and those in the know assured visitors that this was the very pinnacle of the Egyptian season. Not the furnace of summer, yet warm enough to persuade the wealthy to abandon Europe's winter dreariness. Palm trees rustled in the warm breeze that swept down from the Nile, and somewhere in the distance, a muezzin's call drifted across the rooftops. Hercule Poirot sat beneath a striped umbrella, a small cup of Turkish coffee before him, his fingers pressed together in an attitude of profound contentment. He was a man of meticulous habit and travel. Even to Egypt, had not disturbed his essential orderliness. His moustache, that magnificent and carefully tended achievement, was waxed to geometric perfection. His suit, pale grey and impeccably tailored, bore not a speck of dust. Everything about him spoke of precision, method, and an almost theatrical self-regard. Remarkable, is it not? He murmured to his companion, Captain James Hastings, who sat beside him, fanning himself languidly with a copy of yesterday's newspaper. The English come to Egypt seeking the exotic, yet they recreate at Shepherd's precisely the world they have fled. Observe, the afternoon tea service is at 4 o'clock. The conversation concerns only London and the home counties, and the ladies are dressed as though they might encounter the Duchess of Kent on the terrace. Hastings smiled. After many years of association with Poirot, he had grown accustomed to these observations. Halfway between amusement and gentle criticism, I rather think they enjoy a taste of home whilst experiencing something different. Hastings replied, "Besides, Poirot, you have ordered Turkish coffee, yet wear a waistcoat that would be more at home in Belgrave Square. Are we not all seeking this compromise?" A knowing gleam appeared in Poirot's eye. "Touché, my dear Hastings. You have become formidable in debate, but there is a difference, n'est-ce pas? The little grey cells must always be engaged wherever one travels. I seek to understand the essential character of things, whilst the English tourist seeks only to avoid understanding anything whatsoever." The hotel terrace was crowded with precisely the sort of individuals Poirot had described. The British, of course, predominated. Retired colonels and their determined wives, a sprinkling of younger people of good family, and several businessmen engaged in the eternal pursuit of profit. There were also Europeans, a French banker with a calculating eye, a German family of considerable wealth, and an Austrian countess of mysterious means and uncertain age. But it was one particular party that had drawn Poirot's interest, and to which his dark eyes now drifted with the casual air of a man observing nothing in particular. Sir Oswald Cray sat at a corner table, and he was by any measure a remarkable figure. He was perhaps 60 years of age, with the bearing of a man accustomed to authority, and the weathered complexion of one who had spent decades in the East. He had made his considerable fortune in Indian textiles, it was said, and had retired to Cairo 5 years previously to indulge in a passion for Egyptology. His collection of antiquities was reputed to be extensive and valuable, the sort of collection that attracted not only scholars, but also certain unscrupulous individuals for whom an ancient artifact represented merely another commodity. Sir Oswald's wife, the current Lady Cray, was his third marriage, a fact that the English community in Cairo discussed with the sort of knowing discretion that only the English could muster. She was perhaps 35 years of age, striking rather than beautiful, with sharp features and sharper eyes. She had been an actress, obscurely so, and possessed that particular kind of charm that comes from always being very much aware of being observed. Her jewels were substantial but not ostentatious, and she wore them with the carelessness of someone born to wealth rather than acquired into it. With the Crays sat their house guest, Mr. Victor Sanderson, a man of perhaps 40, with the peculiar vacancy of expression that often marks the perpetually wealthy without occupation. Sanderson was connected, through some distant relation, to the Cray family, and he had arrived in Cairo 2 weeks prior. He had the appearance of a man who had never worked a day in his life, and had felt the absence keenly. At a separate table, but unmistakably part of the same circle, was Miss Miriam Cray, the young and rather striking daughter of Sir Oswald from his first marriage. She was 23 years of age, educated at good schools, and possessed of the kind of independent spirit that her stepmother found, quite clearly, tiresome. She read novels, went unchaperoned to the museums, and had been heard discussing ideas with the sort of intensity that suggested she actually thought about such things. Her drawing book was forever evident, filled with sketches both accomplished and ambitious. One observes, Poirot remarked to Hastings in a low voice, that Miss Miriam does not join her father and her stepmother. There is a coldness there, would you say? Not the ordinary coolness of a young woman toward an elder, but something more particular. Perhaps she prefers her own company, Hastings suggested. She seems absorbed in her sketching, indeed. But observe her hands. See how they tremble slightly as she draws. This is not the trembling of artistic passion, but of emotion held carefully in check. And 3 times in the past quarter hour, her gaze has drifted towards the hotel entrance. She awaits someone, or perhaps she fears someone's arrival. As if to underline this observation, a new arrival appeared upon the terrace. A young man of perhaps 28, with dark hair, Mediterranean features, and the kind of athletic bearing that suggested a life of activity rather than idle leisure. He was well dressed, but not fashionably so. There was something earnest about him, as if his clothing served utility rather than display. The effect upon Miss Miriam was instantaneous. Her pencil stilled, and a faint flush crept up her neck. "Ah," said Poirot with quiet satisfaction. "And who, I wonder, is this?" The young man made his way across the terrace with a kind of purposeful uncertainty, as though he knew where he wished to go, but was not entirely convinced he ought to go there. He came directly to Miss Miriam's table, bowed slightly, and she made room for him with a kind of barely concealed delight. "That," said a new voice, "is Dr. Charles Pemberton, a competent physician, I'm told, though he seems to have abandoned medicine in favour of archaeological pursuits. He assists some of the better museums here in their acquisitions and authentications." Poirot turned to find himself addressing a tall, angular woman of perhaps 55, with grey hair pinned in a manner suggesting decades of habitual orderliness. She was Mrs. Dorothy Weatherby, a widow of some considerable reputation in Cairo's English community. She had been married to a diplomat and had remained in Egypt after his death, maintaining a small but elegant apartment near the Opera House. She was known to be well informed about all matters of local society and gossip. "You are acquainted with Dr. Pemberton?" Poirot asked politely. "One knows everyone of any consequence in Cairo," Mrs. Weatherby replied with a smile that suggested she knew a good deal more than was strictly necessary. "Dr. Pemberton is respectable enough, though I confess I find his acquaintance with Miss Miriam Cray somewhat touching and rather troublesome. Sir Oswald does not entirely approve, I believe. His daughter's interests would lie, in his view, in a rather different direction. Toward the merely wealthy, perhaps. Toward the appropriately positioned, Mrs. Weatherby corrected gently, though I should not speak so freely to a stranger. You are newly arrived in Cairo. Only this week, Poirot acknowledged. I came to see the museums and to enjoy the winter season. Cairo is recommended for the nerves, I am told. And indeed, it seems a place of great beauty and tranquillity. Mrs. Weatherby smiled, but there was something almost pitying in her expression. It is that, she said, though like everywhere, Cairo contains its currents and tensions beneath the surface. You must not be deceived by the languor and the heat. There are passions here that burn quite as fiercely as anywhere in Europe. As if to punctuate her remark, a curious incident occurred. A waiter, bearing a tray of glasses, stumbled slightly as he passed Sir Oswald's table. The liquid from one glass splashed across Lady Cray's shoulder, and she rose with a cry of alarm that seemed somewhat disproportionate to the offence. Sir Oswald's response was immediate and rather more severe than the circumstances warranted. He struck the waiter across the face with an open palm, his face suffusing with rage. For a moment there was a terrible silence upon the terrace. Then, just as suddenly, Sir Oswald's face resumed its normal coloration, and he laughed, a strange brittle sound. "I am sorry," he said, addressing the waiter and the assembled company with a kind of forced joviality. "The heat, perhaps. One is not oneself." He produced a substantial note from his wallet and pressed it into the waiter's trembling hand. "No harm done, I hope." "Good heavens," Hastings murmured to Poirot. "That was rather extraordinary." But Poirot's attention was elsewhere. He was observing Sir Oswald with an intensity that suggested he was reading a page written in a foreign language that he happened to understand perfectly, and his gaze thereafter moved methodically around the terrace to Lady Cray, who was composing herself with the careful deliberation of someone very much accustomed to managing her expression, to Victor Sanderson, whose face bore an expression of faintly amused contempt, to Miss Miriam, whose hand had reached across the table and touched Dr. Pemberton's arm, in a gesture that spoke of something beyond the merely friendly, and finally to Dr. Pemberton himself, whose dark eyes held something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "I think," Poirot said quietly to Hastings, "that we shall extend our stay in Cairo, mon ami. There is here something that invites the attention of the orderly mind. And before we see the pyramids, I rather think we may observe something more mysterious and altogether more human. The dinner that evening at Shepherd's Hotel was one of the more elaborate affairs that Cairo's social season had yet produced. The dining room, with its high ceilings and elaborate plasterwork, was illuminated by electric chandeliers that cast everything in a kind of theatrical brilliance. The white tablecloths were immaculate, the silver polished to perfection, and the waiters moved with the precision of a ballet troupe. Poirot found himself, somewhat to his own amusement, seated between Mrs. Weatherby and a Mrs. Carlyle, the wife of a British administrator. On his other side sat Victor Sanderson, who had proven to be a somewhat limited conversationalist, his remarks tending toward the obvious and the comfortable. "You are in antiquities, I am told?" Mrs. Carlyle asked Poirot as the soup course was served. "Not professionally," Poirot replied with a smile, "but I have an interest in all things that speak to the human character across the ages, and Cairo, it seems, is filled with mysteries both ancient and modern." "The ancient mysteries are all quite solved, I should think," Mrs. Weatherby observed. "It is the modern variety that proved troublesome, though I confess Sir Oswald Cray has done excellent work in furthering our understanding of the Ptolemaic period. His collection is quite remarkable, and he is generous in allowing scholars to examine the pieces. He is generous in many ways, I should imagine, Poirot said thoughtfully. A man of such evident wealth and distinction must have cultivated a certain magnanimity. He was generous to his second wife, a new voice observed. A tall, grey-haired man with military bearing who had just seated himself after an aperitif at the bar. This was Colonel Hastings, no relation to Poirot's companion, a retired officer who maintained a small estate outside Cairo. Though not, I understand, in the matter of the divorce settlement. Cray drives a hard bargain when he chooses to. Indeed, Poirot's interest quickened perceptibly. And when did this dissolution of marriage occur? 7 years ago, Colonel Hastings said, before he married the current Lady Cray. Mrs. Eleanor Cray, that was her name, was a woman of considerable charm and accomplishment. It was a surprise to many when Sir Oswald sought the divorce. Eleanor contested it naturally. There was quite a scandal in certain circles. And Miss Miriam, she was young then, 16 when her mother and father separated, Mrs. Weatherby confirmed. She was sent away to school as these things are managed. She returned to Cairo only 2 years ago, after her schooling was completed. Her relationship with her father has been cordial but distant. Poirot absorbed this information with the sort of unhurried attention that characterized all his investigations. And the current Lady Cray, how long has she graced the Cray household? 3 years this coming spring, Mrs. Carlyle replied. She brought some capital to the marriage, I believe, though Sir Oswald hardly required it. She was previously married to an Italian count, though the marriage was of brief duration. There were some whispers that suggested the count found her somewhat independent in her outlook. A woman with a history, then, Poirot observed. Like so many of us, I should imagine. Tell me, is there not a brother in the Cray family as well? Edward, yes, Colonel Hastings said. Younger than Miriam by 3 years. He's been in London these past months, managing his father's business interests there. He's expected to arrive in Cairo within the week, I believe. There was some family business that required his attention in England, but he had planned a visit for the winter season. The mention of this absent family member seemed to create a subtle shift in the conversation. Several of the diners exchanged glances, and there was a brief pause, as though everyone present was simultaneously recalling something that had been temporarily forgotten. Family business? Poirot asked innocently. Of a pressing nature, perhaps? I really could not say, Mrs. Weatherby replied, but her tone suggested that she could indeed say precisely what that business entailed, and had chosen not to do so. We do not discuss such matters. It is not done. The remainder of the dinner proceeded with the kind of civilized conversation that forms the backbone of English social life. Poirot listened more than he spoke, observing the intricate web of relationships and assumptions that bound together Cairo's expatriate community. He noted the way that Victor Sanderson deferred to Colonel Hastings, and how Lady Cray's attention drifted repeatedly toward the dining-room door, as though she expected someone to enter. He observed Miss Miriam's seat, which was conspicuously unoccupied at the family table, and Sir Oswald's occasional glances toward that empty chair, expressions that flickered across his face like shadows on a wall. After dinner, when the gentlemen had retired to the smoking-room and the ladies to the drawing-room, Poirot found himself in conversation with Sir Oswald Cray himself. The baronet was a man of considerable charm when he chose to employ it, and he had apparently decided that a conversation with a gentleman of foreign extraction might prove agreeable. "I am told you are interested in Egyptology," Sir Oswald began, lighting a cigar with the care of one for whom such rituals were important. "I am interested in many things," Poirot replied smoothly. "Human nature above all. And Egypt is a remarkable repository of all that illuminates the human heart across the centuries. Indeed, Sir Oswald agreed. That is precisely my own philosophy. When I retired here, it was not merely to enjoy the climate or to rest from business. It was to study the extraordinary record that Egypt preserves of human ambition, greed, loyalty, and love. The pharaohs were not so very different from modern men, you understand. They desired power, wealth, immortality, the usual things. The only difference is that they had the means to pursue these desires on a grander scale, and the impudence to carve their failures into stone. A trenchant observation, Poirot said, and one might add that they were less skilled, perhaps, at concealing their motivations than modern men. A pharaoh's tomb announces his sins and glories equally. Sir Oswald smiled. You have penetration, Monsieur Poirot. Yes, the ancient world had less to say about discretion and self-concealment. We modern people are much more subtle in our villainy. Would you not agree? Sometimes, Poirot said carefully, subtlety is merely another word for cowardice. But tell me, Sir Oswald, you have a son in London. Your colleague at dinner mentioned this. Ah, yes, Edward. A good boy, though perhaps not as accomplished as a father might wish. He has competence, but little imagination. He manages the textile business in England with adequate efficiency. I had hopes he might develop a greater interest in antiquities. But it seems that the lure of commerce is stronger than the call of scholarship. And yet he visits Cairo regularly? When business permits, Sir Oswald said. He is not, I confess, as devoted a son as one might hope. But we are civilized about it. Families often are, I find. We maintain civility even when affection has become rather attenuated. This last remark was delivered with a kind of sardonic humour that suggested Sir Oswald was speaking from considerable experience. Poirot filed the observation away in the orderly filing system of his mind, where all such remarks were carefully catalogued and cross-referenced. And Miss Miriam? Poirot ventured. She seems a young woman of considerable accomplishment. Something flickered in Sir Oswald's expression. Irritation, perhaps, or anxiety. She is accomplished enough, he said, though her accomplishments do not lie in directions I might have chosen for her. She fills her time with drawing and reading, and associating with young men of dubious prospects. It is the way of the modern young woman, I suppose, less pliable than her predecessors. The young are always a source of surprise to their parents, Poirot observed gently. They insist on having feelings and desires of their own. Very inconvenient, I am told. Sir Oswald's laugh was brief and somewhat hollow. You have a sympathetic nature, Monsieur Poirot. But the young must learn that the world does not order itself according to their whims. Responsibility, duty, position, these are the things that matter, not romantic notions about love and artistic merit and other such nonsense. It was at precisely this moment that there occurred one of those small disturbances that often passes unnoticed but which, to the orderly mind of Hercule Poirot, spoke volumes. A servant had come to the door of the smoking-room, approached Colonel Hastings, and whispered something urgent in his ear. The Colonel's expression had changed perceptibly. He had stood, excused himself with a hurried apology, and departed the room. Through the open door, Poirot had caught a glimpse of Miss Miriam in the hallway beyond, and her face had borne an expression of considerable anxiety. When Captain Hastings, Poirot's companion, noticed this departure and inquired of its cause, Colonel Hastings returned some minutes later with the announcement that a telegram had arrived for Miss Miriam. A telegram of an apparently urgent character, as she had requested the hotel secretary to prepare a response at once. I wonder, Poirot remarked to Victor Sanderson, who had begun to show signs of considerable inebriation. What news might arrive from London that would create such evident agitation? Sanderson peered at Poirot with the exaggerated focus of the drunk man, attempting to appear sober. News? Oh, I should imagine it's from young Edward. Probably saying he's delayed his arrival by a week or some such. The boy is always putting off his visits. Cray finds it tiresome, though he pretends otherwise. Family obligations and so forth. He took another drink. All rather tedious, if you ask me. But then, family always is. That's why I've never bothered with one. Far too complicated. It was not until several hours later, as Poirot lay in his hotel room, preparing his toilet for bed with the methodical care that characterized all his actions, that he reflected upon the curious incident of the telegram, and the expression he had seen upon Miss Miriam's face. It was not, he thought, the expression of one receiving ordinary news from a sibling. It was the expression of one receiving a message that simultaneously confirmed a fear and presented an unanticipated difficulty. The situation evolves, he murmured to himself as he waxed his magnificent moustache to particular perfection. There is here a family at odds with itself, motivated by forces we have not yet perceived. The young woman loves the doctor and fears her father's disapproval. The father fears something else entirely. Though what? The little grey cells have not yet determined. And the telegram from London. Ah, the telegram suggests that events are not proceeding according to expectation. It is all most interesting. And as he settled into sleep, the sounds of Cairo drifting through his open window, the distant muezzin, the ever-present rustle of the Nile, the hum of human activity in a city that never wholly slept. Poirot's mind continued its work, arranging facts and impressions like a meticulous housekeeper, arranging furniture, seeking the perfect placement, the position where all would be revealed in its true significance. The following morning brought with it the quality of light that only the Egyptian winter offers. Crystalline, golden, and seemingly infinite in its clarity. Poirot took his breakfast on the hotel terrace, as was his custom, with a cup of excellent coffee and a small croissant that he consumed with the deliberation of a man for whom even breakfast was a matter of principle. Captain Hastings joined him as the morning was well advanced, looking somewhat refreshed by a night's sleep, but concerned by something he could not quite articulate. "There's an odd atmosphere this morning," Hastings observed, stirring his tea. "Did you notice it? The staff seems uneasy somehow, and I saw Miss Miriam passing through the lobby an hour ago with an expression I can only describe as fraught with concern." "The telegram," Poirot said simply. "It has disturbed her equilibrium. One might speculate as to its contents. But speculation is merely another word for idle imagination. We must observe what emerges naturally from events." But Poirot's apparent calm concealed a mind that was itself working at considerable speed. The telegram had been peculiar in several respects. First, it had arrived at an unusual hour, well past midnight, according to the night clerk. Second, it had caused sufficient agitation that Miss Miriam had risen from her bed to attend to it personally, which suggested it could not wait until morning. Third, and most significantly, Colonel Hastings had mentioned that Miss Miriam had requested the secretary to prepare a response immediately. A response, presumably, that required some consideration, and therefore could not be a mere acknowledgement. It was mid-morning when the second unusual occurrence took place. Victor Sanderson, who had made something of a career out of appearing at precisely the wrong moment in every situation, came upon Poirot and Hastings with the air of a man who bore important intelligence. "I say," Sanderson began, seating himself uninvited at their table, "there's been the most extraordinary development. You'll never credit it, but Craze received a letter from his solicitor in London. An urgent letter, delivered by courier this morning. The messenger came all the way from Alexandria in the night. Must be something of considerable importance, I should think. Lady Cray overheard the discussion between Cray and his secretary. She seemed rather put out about something. Information of legal import is often distressing, Poirot observed, without particular interest. Business matters frequently carry an emotional weight disproportionate to their actual significance. But it's more than that, Sanderson pressed on, pleased to have captured an audience. The thing is, I happened to see the messenger before he left. Young fellow, sharp-eyed. He had the look of someone who deals in delicate matters. And when I spoke to one of the hotel staff, they mentioned that the letter bore the letterhead of Mortensen and Cray. That's the family's law firm, I believe. They specialize in matters of inheritance and property settlement. Stands to reason that something's afoot. Poirot's dark eyes fixed upon Sanderson with sudden and complete attention. This messenger, he was Egyptian or English? Oh, English, certainly. Rather young for such a responsible undertaking, but engaged and efficient. Reminded me rather of a court clerk or legal assistant. And the letter itself. Did you observe anything of its physical appearance? Sanderson, pleased by this evidence of interest, leaned forward conspiratorially. Sealed with red wax, stamped with the firm's seal. But here's the thing. The envelope bore not merely the hotel address, but specifically private, to be delivered to Sir Oswald Cray alone. Rather dramatic, wouldn't you say? After Sanderson had withdrawn, satisfied with having dispensed his information and eager to investigate other mysteries of the Cairo social scene, Poirot sat in silence for several minutes. His fingers were pressed together in his characteristic attitude of reflection, and his gaze was fixed upon the distant Nile, visible between the palms. I should very much like to know, he said finally to Hastings, what legal matter could be so urgent that it requires dispatch by courier from London to Cairo? And I should like to know, with perhaps even greater urgency, why the arrival of this letter seems to have coincided with, or perhaps precipitated, the dispatch of that telegram to Miss Miriam in the night hours. You believe there is a connection? Hastings asked. Connection is a word of multiple meanings, Poirot replied. Cause and effect are related, but they are not always connected in the manner we assume. However, in this instance, my intuition, which has not often led me astray, suggests that these two pieces of information are linked as threads in a tapestry. The pattern is not yet clear, but the threads are there, waiting to be followed to their source. The afternoon brought a third disturbance to the orderly routine of the hotel and its guests. It was customary for the Cray household, Sir Oswald, Lady Cray, and their various guests and family members, to take a late tea in the lounge at 4 o'clock. This afternoon, Miss Miriam appeared at the appointed hour, but alone, and looking decidedly unwell. Her face was pale, and there was something about her bearing that suggested she was maintaining her composure through considerable effort. When Dr. Charles Pemberton, who happened to be in the lounge on unrelated business, saw her condition, he moved with immediate concern to her side. Their conversation was conducted in low tones, but Poirot, whose hearing was remarkably acute when occasion warranted, caught enough to understand that Dr. Pemberton was urging Miss Miriam to sit down, and that she was explaining that she was perfectly well, merely fatigued by the heat. But she was not well, Poirot observed. She was frightened. When Lady Cray arrived at the appointed tea time, alone and without her husband, she noted Miss Miriam's presence with an expression that was difficult to pass. Was it concern? Irritation? Poirot's experience with the human face suggested it was neither, but rather a kind of cold calculation, as though Lady Cray were rapidly assessing some internal equation and determining the result. "My dear Miriam," Lady Cray said, approaching the younger woman with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "You are not usually at tea. I trust nothing is amiss?" "Not at all," Miss Miriam replied, her voice carrying only the slightest tremor. "I merely felt the need for society this afternoon. Where is father?" "In his study," Lady Cray said, arranging herself with considerable grace in a wing chair. "He received some correspondence this morning that demanded his attention. He seemed rather absorbed by it. I expect he will join us presently." But Sir Oswald did not join them, and when, some 30 minutes later, his valet was sent to discover the reason for his continued absence, he returned with the report that Sir Oswald was not in his study at all. He had left the hotel, it seemed, approximately an hour earlier, departing in the carriage with instructions to the driver regarding a destination in the Arab quarter. "How very irregular," Lady Cray observed, and Poirot could not determine whether her tone reflected genuine surprise or merely performed surprise. "My husband so rarely leaves the hotel at this hour. He finds the afternoon rest particularly necessary in this climate." For Hercule Poirot, however, the departure of Sir Oswald was merely the final note in a composition that had been building throughout the day. A lawyer's letter dispatched with great urgency, a telegram arriving in the dead of night, creating agitation in a young woman already emotionally vulnerable, the mysterious departure of a man who clearly bore some concern upon his mind. "I rather think," Poirot said to Captain Hastings, as they took a turn through the hotel gardens before dinner, "that we are approaching a moment of crisis. The elements are in place. The family tension, the legal complication, the arrival of a young woman in the life of a man's daughter who does not approve of her son. All of these factors are pressing towards some resolution, and I have a most uncomfortable sensation, the sensation that this resolution will not be bloodless." "You think something terrible will occur?" Hastings asked, his face registering concern. "I think," Poirot said carefully, "that something has already occurred, and what we observe is merely the surface manifestation of a disturbance that runs much deeper. As to what form the ultimate resolution will take, the little grey cells are not yet able to determine. But of this I am certain. We have not yet reached the heart of the matter. And before we do, before all is revealed in its true and terrible significance, I suspect there will be one more piece added to this puzzle, one more element that will shift the entire pattern and render all that went before comprehensible." As if in response to his words, night fell across Cairo with the suddenness that only the Egyptian sky can command. One moment it was afternoon, and in the next, darkness had descended, bringing with it the thousand small sounds of the city after sunset. In the hotel, lights were illuminated, candles were lit, and the gentle routines of civilized evening life resumed. But Poirot sat alone in his room, his mind working with the precision of a clock mechanism, arranging and rearranging the facts until they might fall into some pattern that would reveal their underlying order. And in that order, he sensed, lay not only explanation, but justice. The discovery was made at 7:30 in the morning. One of the hotel servants, a young Egyptian man named Rashid, had come to the residence apartment of Sir Oswald Cray to attend to the early routines of the day. He had found the study door locked from the inside, which was unusual but not unprecedented. When his knock at the door elicited no response, he had gone to summon the hotel manager. By the time Poirot and Hastings had dressed and made their way to the scene, having been informed of the situation by an anxious assistant manager, the locked door had been forced, and the discovery had been made. Sir Oswald Grey lay in his chair behind his desk, his head tilted back, his eyes staring at nothing. There was no visible wound, no apparent violence. He might have been asleep, were it not for the terrible rigidity of his posture, and the peculiar discoloration visible about his lips and the margins of his eyes. On the desk before him lay a glass, empty save for a small residue of liquid. There was also an open bottle of whiskey, a glass with whiskey remaining in it, which would later be determined to be merely whiskey, and nothing more. And a letter, half finished, in Sir Oswald's own hand. "Good God," said Colonel Hastings, who had been summoned to the scene as a man of official standing in the English community. "Has the man poisoned himself?" It was the obvious conclusion, the apparent conclusion. A man discovered dead in a locked study, with an empty glass before him, and the suggestion of poison upon his lips. Such a man had clearly taken his own life. Suicide is a convenient conclusion, Poirot reflected. It requires no investigation, assigns guilt to the only person who cannot defend himself, and allows society to move forward with minimal disruption. But Hercule Poirot did not believe in convenient conclusions. "The letter," he said quietly to the hotel manager. "That letter which lies upon the desk, it is incomplete, you observe. The writing trails away midway through a sentence. It is the letter of a man interrupted, not a man concluding his affairs. You do not believe it to be suicide?" Colonel Hastings asked, surprise evident in his voice. "I believe," Poirot said, "that I know very little at this moment, which is a position I find most uncomfortable. But I know this. A man does not begin to write what appears to be a letter of farewell, and then neglect to complete it, whether from lack of will or sudden inspiration. This letter was not finished when Sir Oswald died. This letter was interrupted." He examined the room with meticulous care, touching nothing, observing everything. The windows were locked from the inside. The desk bore the arrangement of a man's personal effects in habitual order. Nothing was disturbed or overturned. Yet something about the room spoke to him of violation and intrusion. "Where is Lady Grey?" Poirot asked suddenly. There was a confused bustle of response, and it was determined that Lady Grey had risen at the usual hour, taken her breakfast in her room, and was even now in the sitting-room of the suite, where she sat in a state of considerable shock. When Poirot was permitted to speak with her, he found her remarkably composed for a woman whose husband had only hours before been discovered dead. "This is terrible," she said, and her voice was steady. "Terrible and inexplicable. My husband was in good spirits yesterday evening. There was no indication, no whisper of despair. And yet the evidence suggests he took his own life," Poirot observed gently. "I cannot believe it," Lady Grey replied. "Yet what else is to be believed? He was alone in his study. The door was locked. There was poison, surely it must be poison, in the glass beside him. What other explanation can there be? There is, I confess, a limited list of possibilities," Poirot agreed. "But Miss Miriam, she was here in the suite. She did not hear anything unusual in the night." "Miriam keeps to her own apartments," Lady Grey said. "My stepdaughter is not. We do not share the confidence that one might wish between a young woman and her stepmother. She would not have heard anything. The study is somewhat removed from the family bedrooms." When Poirot was permitted to examine the letter more closely under the watchful eye of a local police official who had been summoned at Colonel Hastings' insistence, he noted that the handwriting was indeed Sir Oswald's, educated and precise. The letter began with the words, "I can no longer bear," and then descended into what appeared to be increasingly erratic script before trailing away entirely. But there was something, about that disintegration that troubled him. It was too theatrical somehow, too much the performance of a man writing what he believed a suicide note should contain, rather than the genuine expressions of a man in despair. By midday, the initial shock had given way to a kind of controlled chaos. The Cairo police had arrived, along with the British consul and various officials whose exact function was unclear, but whose presence was nonetheless required by protocol. The hotel had taken on the atmosphere of a besieged fortress, with guests observing the comings and goings of authorities, with the sort of theatrical interest that only real disaster can create. It was in this atmosphere of confusion that Poirot found himself in conversation with Miss Miriam in one of the hotel's smaller drawing rooms. The young woman appeared to have aged 10 years overnight. Her face was drawn, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she had experienced a shock rather more profound than the mere discovery of her father's death. "Miss Miriam," Poirot began gently, "I know this is a most difficult time, but I must ask you some questions if you are able to answer them. The Egyptian police will wish to speak with you officially, but it would be helpful if you were to speak with me first, frankly and without restraint." Miriam's hands trembled as she gripped them together in her lap. "I don't understand," she said. "Why would father? I mean, it's impossible. There must be some mistake, some terrible misunderstanding." "Perhaps there is," Poirot said encouragingly. "Tell me, Miss Miriam, you received a telegram yesterday evening, at a late hour, a telegram that created considerable concern?" Miriam's eyes widened, but she did not deny it. "How did you know about that?" "I make it my business to know such things," Poirot said. "But more importantly, I wish to know what the telegram contained." "It was from your brother Edward?" "Yes," Miriam said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Edward sent word that he was arriving in Cairo earlier than expected. Today, in fact. His ship came in at Alexandria in the early hours of this morning. He was to arrive at the hotel this afternoon. And this news disturbed you greatly. You must understand," Miriam said. And now there was passion in her voice, a kind of desperation to be understood. "My brother and my father have been at odds for years. Edward wanted to go into archaeology, into scholarship, but father insisted he take over the business in London. Edward has always resented it, and father has always felt that Edward was ungrateful, undutiful. In recent months, I don't know all the details, but there was talk of some disagreement about the estate, about father's will. Edward was angry, and I feared—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. "You feared?" Poirot prompted. "I feared that when Edward arrived there would be a terrible confrontation. Father had received a letter from his solicitors this morning. I don't know what it contained, but it threw him into a state. He seemed distressed, unsettled. And then Edward's telegram arrived to say he was coming, and I thought perhaps it had all come to a head, that Edward had taken some action, and father was responding to it. What sort of action?" "I don't know," Miriam said, but Edward implied in his telegram that he was bringing news that would require father's immediate attention. And Edward's tone was angry, harsh, in a way I've rarely seen from him. Poirot absorbed this information with his characteristic care. He then asked several other questions about Sir Oswald's habits, his state of mind, the arrangements of the household. But it was this matter of the telegram and the expected arrival of Edward Cray that held the centre of his attention. "One final question, Miss Miriam," he said as he rose to leave. "The letter that was found upon your father's desk, the unfinished letter. Did you know that your father was writing such a document?" "No," Miriam said. "Father wrote many letters. He was a prolific correspondent. I would not have known of it unless he had mentioned it." "And did he mention it?" "He did not." When Poirot emerged from this conversation, he found Captain Hastings waiting for him in the lobby. The good captain bore an expression of considerable curiosity and concern. "Well?" Hastings asked. "What did Miss Miriam have to say?" "She tells an interesting tale," Poirot said, "of a telegram received, of a brother expected, of legal disputes and family tensions, and she tells it with the sincerity of one who believes every word she is speaking. Yet, my dear Hastings, the question that troubles me is this. Is she telling the truth because she knows the truth? Or is she telling the truth because she believes what she has been told?" "I'm afraid I don't follow." "Neither do I," Poirot admitted, "which is a state of affairs I find most unsatisfactory. But I believe it is a state of affairs that will not endure. Already the evidence accumulates. Already the pattern begins to form. We have only to observe carefully what occurs over the next few hours, and I believe the truth will assert itself." And it was not long before that assertion began. The Egyptian police, it became apparent, were perfectly content to classify the death of Sir Oswald Grey as suicide. The evidence seemed clear. A locked room, an empty glass containing traces of what would prove to be strychnine, a letter suggesting despair. The matter could be closed, reported, filed away. The British consul was satisfied. The hotel manager was relieved, and society at large could move forward with minimal disruption. All of this assumed, of course, that Hercule Poirot was willing to accept such a convenient conclusion. He was not. On the afternoon following the discovery, Poirot requested permission from the local authorities to examine the scene more thoroughly. This request was granted with a kind of bemused tolerance. The authorities had seen many English eccentric travellers, and assumed this Belgian gentleman to be of the same variety. Permission granted, Poirot spent 3 hours in the study of the deceased Sir Oswald Grey, examining every object, every surface, every particular detail, with the sort of focus that would have seemed excessive to the casual observer, but which was, to Poirot himself, the essence of orderly investigation. "Now then," he said finally to Captain Hastings, who had been permitted to accompany him in his examination, "let us consider what we observe. First, the room itself. It is, as we are told, locked from the inside. The key is in the lock. The windows are closed and locked. There is no possibility of entry or exit save through the door. This seems to support the theory of suicide. But consider also this. The room is astonishingly neat. The papers on the desk are arranged with precision. The books on the shelves are in perfect order. Everything suggests a man of meticulous habit and orderly mind. Such a man, if he were to take his own life, would he not arrange his affairs entirely? Would he not complete his letter? Would he not leave instructions regarding his will, his wishes, his assets? The incomplete letter disturbs me, Hastings. It disturbs me greatly. But he may have been interrupted by the poison taking effect, Hastings suggested. He may have meant to finish but found himself unable to do so. A possibility, Poirot conceded. But consider the glass. The glass contains only a small residue of liquid. If Sir Oswald had drunk a quantity of strychnine-laced liquid sufficient to kill him, where is that liquid? The glass before him could not possibly have contained enough to do the deed. He would have required to drink much more. Yet the bottle of whiskey shows no signs of unusual consumption. When the police examined it, they found it to be nearly full. Could he have had another glass, drunk from something else? Precisely what I have been wondering, Poirot said. But there is no other glass in this room. No second vessel that might have contained the poison. The maids who attended to the room this morning reported that everything was as it always was, except, of course, for the presence of a dead body and an empty glass. He moved to the desk and examined the letter more closely, though he did not touch it. "And there is this," he continued, "the handwriting. It is Sir Oswald's hand beyond any doubt. But observe the degradation in the script as one descends the page. It becomes increasingly erratic, increasingly wild. This could suggest the effect of poison upon the muscles, yes, but it could also suggest something else entirely." "What do you mean?" Hastings asked. "I mean, my dear friend, that the handwriting might degrade, not because Sir Oswald's body was failing, but because Sir Oswald was not writing at all during portions of this letter. Someone else may have completed what Sir Oswald began, someone writing in imitation of his hand, an imitation that became less precise as the forger's concentration waned, or as they ceased to care whether the forgery was perfect." This suggestion struck Hastings with considerable force, but surely such a forgery would be obvious to an expert. "It might be," Poirot agreed, "if an expert were to look for it. But no expert has looked, because everyone has concluded the death to be suicide, and therefore ceased to investigate further. This is the curious power of the obvious conclusion. It prevents inquiry." For the next several hours, Poirot conducted a series of interviews with the hotel staff, the family members, and such guests as had been in proximity to the Cray apartments on the night of Sir Oswald's death. These interviews revealed several facts of interest. First, the valet who had last seen Sir Oswald alive reported that the baronet had returned from his mysterious departure into Cairo at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening. He had seemed preoccupied and had eaten a light dinner alone in his study. He had mentioned that he wished to work on correspondence and was not to be disturbed. Second, the housemaid responsible for that corridor reported that she had heard sounds from the study at approximately 9 o'clock. The sound of someone moving about, and what might have been conversation, though she could not determine how many voices were involved or what was being said. Third, and most intriguingly, the night porter reported that at approximately 11 o'clock, he had seen Lady Cray departing the study with an expression that he described as agitated but controlled. She had not seen him, and he had not thought to mention it to anyone until Poirot specifically inquired about unusual occurrences during the night. "You are beginning to form a picture?" Poirot asked Hastings as they sat in the lobby later that evening. "I am beginning to form several pictures, all of them confused," Hastings admitted. "If Lady Cray was in the study with Sir Oswald late in the evening, what was the nature of their encounter? And if she departed agitated, does that not suggest conflict between them?" "It suggests the possibility of conflict," Poirot agreed, "but it does not confirm it. Lady Cray might have been agitated for many reasons. She might have been distressed by the contents of the letter from the solicitors, by news of her stepson's imminent arrival, or by any number of other causes. We cannot assume guilt based on agitation. However, we can note the fact and consider it in relation to other evidence." It was at this point that Edward Cray himself finally arrived in Cairo. He appeared in the lobby of Shepherd's Hotel at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a handsome young man of perhaps 26 years, with his father's bearing but his mother's features. He was dressed in travelling clothes that bore the dust of train and carriage, and his first action upon learning of his father's death was to sit down heavily in one of the lobby chairs and stare at nothing for several minutes. When he had recovered sufficiently to converse, Poirot introduced himself and requested the opportunity to speak with Mr. Cray privately. In a small sitting room adjacent to the lobby, with Captain Hastings present to observe and record, Poirot began his examination of the younger Cray. "You are recently arrived from London?" he asked gently. "This morning," Edward confirmed. My ship docked at Alexandria early, and I travelled directly here. I arrived to find my father dead, and the hotel in a state of considerable chaos. What happened? The authorities seem to think he took his own life, but that seems impossible. My father was many things, but he was not a weak man. Suicide was never a possibility in his nature. And yet the evidence seems to support such a conclusion. Poirot observed. A locked room, a glass containing poison, an unfinished letter suggesting despair. My father despair. Edward's voice carried an undertone of something that might have been bitterness. My father was incapable of despair, monsieur. He was incapable of any emotion that suggested weakness or loss of control. He was incapable of anything, in fact, that suggested he was human at all. You did not love your father? Poirot asked with great gentleness. Edward was silent for a long moment. I loved the idea of my father, he said finally. The man he might have been. But the father I actually knew was a perfectionist, a tyrant, a man for whom duty and obligation were the only admissible values. He despised sentiment. He regarded emotion as a form of weakness. He had no patience for my interests, my aspirations, my attempts to make a life according to my own understanding. And he made his disapproval very clear. And yet you wrote to your sister of news that would require his immediate attention? News that your tone suggested was confrontational. Edward's face stiffened. My sister told you that? She did. It was no secret, you understand. A simple fact that became relevant to my understanding of recent events. Edward seemed to struggle with himself for a moment, as though deciding how much to reveal. The news concerned the estate, he said finally, and the business. There were matters that required clarification, matters that father had left unresolved. I had learned things in London that suggested he had not been forthright with his solicitors regarding certain financial arrangements. I intended to confront him about it. Financial arrangements of what nature? Arrangements that suggested father was not as wealthy as he had always claimed. Edward said grimly, My investigation in London revealed that several of his business ventures have failed or underperformed in recent years. The textile business is profitable, yes, but not to the degree that his expenditure in Egypt would suggest. Either he was drawing down capital at a remarkable rate, or his assets were not what he represented them to be. I intended to demand an accounting. And was this accounting to be provided? I was not here long enough to discover, Edward said. I arrived this morning to find my father dead. All my questions died with him. Over the next several hours, Poirot conducted interviews with every person who had been in proximity to Sir Oswald Cray in the days preceding his death. Victor Sanderson proved to have known nothing of significance. The hotel manager and various servants added small details, but nothing of import. But when Poirot finally spoke with Dr. Charles Pemberton, who had volunteered his own account of his movements and knowledge, an interesting detail emerged. I saw Sir Oswald on the day he died, Dr. Pemberton explained, in the afternoon. He was in the Arab quarter, near the museum where I had been assisting with an authentication. He seemed distressed, even agitated, which was unusual, as Sir Oswald generally maintained the most rigorous control over his emotions. He did not see me, I don't believe, but I observed him entering a building that houses several legal offices and private archives. I remember thinking at the time that his presence was unusual. Sir Oswald did not typically conduct business in such quarters. Do you remember which building precisely? Poirot asked, his interest noticeably quickening. Dr. Pemberton provided the address, and Poirot made a note of it with meticulous care. That evening, with the permission of the police authorities, Poirot and Captain Hastings made their way to the address Dr. Pemberton had provided. It was a modest building in the older quarter of Cairo. occupied by several professional gentlemen whose letterheads suggested dealings in law, estate management, and private inquiry. The proprietor of one such establishment, a rather shabby gentleman named Hassan, who maintained an office devoted to the investigation of matters, both personal and professional, proved to have a clear recollection of Sir Oswald's visit. Yes, yes, Hassan said, his eyes darting between Poirot and Hastings with an expression suggesting he was not entirely confident in the advisability of revealing his client's business. Sir Oswald came to me 2 days ago. He wished to inquire whether I had been retained by any other party to investigate certain matters concerning his household. And had you been so retained? Poirot asked. I had not, Hassan said carefully, but I had been retained to investigate certain matters concerning the estate of Sir Oswald Cray by another interested party. This investigation was commenced some 6 months prior. By whom? That I cannot say, Hassan replied. My clients value their privacy greatly, but I can tell you that the investigation concerned the financial affairs of Sir Oswald and the distribution of his estate. Sir Oswald became aware of this investigation, I do not know precisely how, and came to me to discover the identity of his watcher. And did you provide this information? Hassan hesitated. I provided certain information, he said finally. That is all I can say in good conscience. When they had left Hassan's office, Captain Hastings turned to Poirot with considerable excitement. Good Lord, he exclaimed. This is extraordinary. Someone was having Sir Oswald investigated, spied upon, essentially. And Sir Oswald discovered it and sought to learn who was behind the investigation. The implications are extraordinary. The implications, Poirot agreed quietly, are indeed significant, but they do not in themselves clarify the essential question. Who killed Sir Oswald Cray? And for what purpose? The revelation of Sir Oswald's paranoia, for so it must be called, cast new light upon the circumstances of his death. The family gathered in the hotel's private drawing-room the following morning, summoned at Poirot's request to discuss certain matters of importance. Lady Cray reclined upon a sofa with an expression of carefully composed grief. Edward sat rigidly in a chair across from her, his posture suggesting that he would have preferred to be elsewhere. Miss Miriam occupied a smaller chair near the window, her drawing materials untouched beside her. Victor Sanderson lounged against the mantelpiece with the air of a man who knew he had no business being present but was determined to remain anyway. I have been considering the circumstances of your father's death, Poirot began, his hands clasped before him in his characteristic gesture, and I find that the obvious conclusion that he took his own life does not entirely satisfy the requirements of logical reason. There are, you understand, certain inconsistencies that demand explanation. Are you suggesting that my father did not commit suicide? Edward asked sharply. I am suggesting, Poirot replied, that the matter is not as simple as it has been made to appear. Sir Oswald was a man of considerable will and considerable concern for order and control. He had recently become aware that someone was investigating his affairs, investigating them without his knowledge or consent. He was disturbed by this discovery, understandably so. But would such a discovery drive him to take his own life? Or would it, more likely, drive him to discover who was behind the investigation and to take steps to thwart such interference? Perhaps the investigation revealed something so damaging that father saw no way out, Miriam suggested softly. Perhaps his financial difficulties were more severe than anyone suspected. Ah, so you are aware of the financial difficulties? Poirot asked with interest. Edward mentioned them to me this morning, Miriam said. He told me that father's wealth was not as substantial as he had always claimed. But surely that alone could not have driven him to suicide. Could not or would not? Poirot mused. The distinction is important. A man's pride can be wounded in many ways, and the wounding of pride is often more damaging than the loss of mere wealth. A man who has built an empire on the foundation of appearing to be wealthier, more successful, more in control than he actually is, might find the revelation of that falsity to be unbearable. But father was not such a man, Edward protested. He was ruthless, yes, proud, certainly, but he was not vain in that particular sense. His pride lay in his accomplishments, not in appearances. Did it? Poirot asked gently. Consider. He maintained this hotel suite, displayed his collection of antiquities for public admiration, ensured that his name appeared regularly in the Cairo society pages. These are the actions of a man very much concerned with appearances, would you not say? Before Edward could respond, Lady Cray intervened, her voice soft, but carrying a note of iron beneath. "I think you are mistaken, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "My husband was indeed a proud man, but his pride was rooted in genuine accomplishment. The investigation that disturbed him was not about his finances. He was aware of some difficulties, yes, but he regarded them as temporary matters to be resolved. What disturbed him was the violation of his privacy, the intrusion of some unseen observer into his affairs. That was what troubled him most profoundly." "You seem to have been party to his concerns," Poirot observed. "The night porter reported seeing you depart from his study at a late hour on the evening of his death. Would you care to explain the nature of that conversation?" Lady Cray's composure flickered for only a moment, but Poirot caught it. A tiny fracture in the carefully maintained facade. "I spoke with my husband because I was concerned about him," she said carefully. "He had been distant and preoccupied for several days. I went to his study to inquire if there was anything I might do to ease his mind. We discussed various matters, and eventually I left him to his work." "And his mood when you departed?" "You described it to the porter as agitated but controlled." "I made no such description," Lady Cray said coolly. "The porter made that observation, not I. I can only say that my husband was as he always was, controlled, methodical, possessed of perfect self-command. Admirable qualities in a man, certainly," Poirot observed, "but qualities that might disguise considerable emotional turmoil. Would you not agree? A man might maintain perfect external composure while internally experiencing considerable distress." It was at this moment that Victor Sanderson, who had been listening with increasing tension, suddenly stood up from his lounging position against the mantelpiece. "This is absurd," he declared. "You are all dancing around the obvious conclusion. Sir Oswald was in debt. He had been living beyond his means. The investigation he was so concerned about would have revealed this to his family, to his business associates, to society at large. The shame would have been unbearable for a man of his pride. He took a dose of poison and ended it. Case closed. Why are we wasting time with speculation? Because," Poirot said quietly, "one does not end one's life in a locked study at the precise moment when one's son is arriving in Cairo to confront one regarding these very matters. Such timing seems too convenient, too pat, too theatrical. A man in such circumstances might consider suicide, yes, but he would more likely be too preoccupied with defending himself, with attempting to manage the crisis, to actually carry out such an act. The mind resists self-annihilation when it is actively engaged in the struggle for survival." "Then what do you propose?" Edward demanded. "You clearly believe my father did not take his own life. So what is your theory?" Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out upon the Cairo landscape with an expression of profound contemplation. "My theory," he said slowly, is that someone wished your father to appear to have taken his own life. Someone who had motive and opportunity to administer the poison, and who possessed sufficient knowledge of your father's habits and personality to create a convincing scene of suicide. Someone, furthermore, who understood that the revelation of certain financial difficulties would make such a suicide seem plausible to investigators. You are describing a murderer, Miriam breathed. I am describing a person who wished a death to occur and took steps to ensure that the investigation of that death would be cursory and superficial. Poirot agreed. Whether the intention was truly to murder, or whether it was to remove an inconvenient problem, while ensuring that no suspicion would fall upon the perpetrator, I cannot yet determine. But murder, or something very nearly akin to it, has occurred in this hotel. Then who did it? Victor Sanderson demanded. Who among us could have had such motive and opportunity? Ah, said Poirot, turning from the window. That is the question that brings us to the heart of the matter, and the answer, I believe, lies in understanding precisely what it was that motivated the investigation into Sir Oswald's affairs. Who was it that retained Hassan to investigate? And why? It was now that Poirot produced from his pocket a piece of paper. A document obtained, through certain methods that he did not care to explain, from Hassan's private files. This is a letter, he explained, commissioning Hassan to investigate the financial affairs of Sir Oswald Grey. It was signed by a solicitor in London named Mortensen, acting as agent for a party whose identity is not revealed in the correspondence, but who is referred to only as the interested party. This correspondence was initiated 6 months ago, a point of significant interest. He paused, allowing the impact of this revelation to settle upon his audience. 6 months ago, he continued, Edward Grey was involved in a bitter dispute with his father regarding his inheritance and his freedom to pursue his own interests. 6 months ago, Lady Grey's marriage to Sir Oswald was already strained by certain indiscretions on Sir Oswald's part regarding a younger woman in Cairo's society. 6 months ago, Miss Miriam was becoming increasingly attached to Dr. Pemberton, an attachment her father did not approve. 6 months ago, the will of Sir Oswald Grey was rewritten, a fact known to his solicitors but kept from his family. How do you know that? Edward asked sharply. Because I made inquiries, Poirot explained. I questioned the solicitor's assistant, a young man whose discretion can be purchased for a modest sum. He confirmed that Sir Oswald had recently altered his will, and that this alteration involved a reduction in the bequest to his son, and an increase in the bequest to his wife. A curious alteration, would you not say, particularly in light of the marital difficulties? Edward's face had gone pale. Then my father was planning to cut me off entirely. I do not know his final intention, Poirot said gently, but the change in the will certainly suggests a deterioration in your relationship with him, and it is this deterioration, I believe, that forms the root of our investigation. The atmosphere in the drawing room had become heavy with tension. Lady Grey had risen from her sofa and now stood at the window, her back to the company. Miriam sat very still, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Edward stared at Poirot with an intensity that suggested he was attempting to read the detective's mind. You are suggesting, Edward said slowly, that someone killed my father in order to prevent the alteration of his will. I am suggesting a possibility, Poirot replied. A possibility that rests upon the question of motive. In cases of murder, motive is always paramount, and in this case there are several motives visible to the observer who cares to look. Your father's wife stands to inherit approximately £50,000 under the will that her husband had recently altered in her favour. Your father's son stands to inherit considerably less than he might have inherited had the previous will remained in effect. Your father's daughter faces a future constrained by her father's disapproval and her diminished inheritance, and your father's young physician friend stands to lose access to your father's considerable collection of antiquities, which were to be bequeathed to the museum, a bequeathal your father had recently reconsidered. You are suggesting that one of these parties murdered my father? Miriam asked, her voice trembling. I am suggesting, Poirot said, that motive exists. As to which of these parties possessed both motive and opportunity, that is a question that requires more investigation. Then investigate, Edward declared. Investigate fully and completely. My father may have been a difficult man, but he was my father. If he has been murdered, then that murder must be avenged. That evening, Poirot sat alone in his hotel room, his small but brilliant mind engaged in the work that it did best. The arrangement of facts into order, the discovery of pattern in apparent chaos, the reduction of complexity to elegant simplicity. On a table before him lay every scrap of evidence, every observation, every inconsistency that had been discovered, the locked room and the empty glass, the incomplete letter suggesting suicide, yet bearing signs of forgery, the testimony of the night porter regarding Lady Cray's departure from the study, the overheard conversation at 9 o'clock, voices, but no clear identification, Edward's arrival, timed too conveniently to be coincidental. The investigation into Sir Oswald's finances, initiated 6 months prior, the alteration of the will, favouring Lady Cray, Sir Oswald's discovery of the investigation, his distress, his mysterious afternoon departure into Cairo, the bottle of whisky in the study, nearly full, yet claimed to contain the poisoned drink, the nature of the poison itself, strychnine, a substance requiring considerable knowledge to administer. And beneath all these facts lay the fundamental question. How did the poison enter Sir Oswald's body if he did not consume it willingly, and if there was no drink in the room containing a sufficient quantity to effect his death? The answer came to Poirot not as a sudden illumination, but as a gradual clarification, as though a fog were slowly lifting from a landscape already familiar. The poison had not been in the glass. The glass had been placed there afterward, as part of the staging of the suicide scene. The poison had been administered in another drink entirely. One of the evening beverages, perhaps. A drink offered in good faith, consumed without suspicion, its true nature unknown to the man who drank it. And who had been alone with Sir Oswald in the hours before his death? Who had the opportunity to offer such a drink? Who had the motive to wish him dead? The answer came in a cascade of understanding. The will favouring Lady Cray had been recent, but the investigation into Sir Oswald's finances had been initiated 6 months prior. Who would have reason to investigate a man's finances months before his death? Who would have cause to wish to understand the true state of his wealth and his debts? A person who stood to inherit from him. A person who wished to know whether the inheritance would be substantial or illusory. A person who had reason to fear that the inheritance might be reduced or entirely withheld. The poison was strychnine, a substance requiring knowledge to administer safely, to ensure rapid effect without leaving obvious evidence. Who possessed such knowledge? The obvious answer was a physician, but there were other possibilities. Someone with a background in chemistry, or someone who had access to expert advice. The incomplete letter bore signs of forgery, as though someone had attempted to continue Sir Oswald's handwriting after he had lost the ability to write. Why forge a suicide note? Because the original suicide note had been deemed insufficient. because someone wished to ensure that the conclusion of suicide was absolutely certain, beyond any possibility of question. And why stage the scene in a locked room? Because a locked room dramatically reduced the possibilities. A locked room made external agency seem impossible. A locked room screamed suicide to any investigator. But the mechanism of the locking was crucial. The door had been locked from the inside, the key remaining in the lock. But a door locked from inside could be accomplished by someone outside, using a simple technique. A key turned from the external side and then removed. The door thus locked, and the key subsequently reinserted from the inside. Such a feat required only the removal of the key after the victim was dead, its reinsertion from within the room, and a subsequent removal again, leaving the appearance of internal locking. Or, and this was equally possible, someone inside the room had locked the door after administering the poison, ensuring that the body would not be discovered until the morning, when the staged suicide would be perfectly clear. That person had then exited through a window, or had been let out by an accomplice, or had simply opened the door and left after nightfall, the hotel servants being occupied with other duties. All of these possibilities pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Lady Cray had poisoned her husband, not from passion, not from sudden impulse, but from cold calculation and premeditation. She had discovered that her marriage was not to her advantage, that her husband's finances were not as secure as she had believed. She had realized that his recent alteration of his will in her favor was merely a gesture, a temporary favor that might be revoked at any moment. She had understood that her position was precarious, and so she had acted. She had retained Hassan to investigate her husband's affairs, ostensibly to discover his true financial position. She had discovered it to be worse than she had feared. He was living on capital, burning through his wealth at an alarming rate. She had realized that she needed to act before he had opportunity to further alter his will in a direction less favorable to her. She had obtained strychnine, not difficult in Cairo, a city where such substances were available to those who knew where to look. She had administered it in some drink offered innocently to her husband. She had waited for the poison to take effect, ensuring that she was out of his sight when death came. She had then returned to the study, having ensured that the door would lock behind her when she left. She had completed the suicide note in an imitation of her husband's hand that was close enough to deceive a cursory examination. She had arranged the glass and the bottle to create the appearance of a man who had attempted to end his suffering through chemical means. And then she had departed, her face showing just the right degree of agitation to a convenient night porter, ensuring that she would be observed and that her concern would be noted. It was, Poirot had to admit, an elegant piece of work. The perpetrator had calculated every detail, had arranged every element, had left nothing to chance. It was precisely the kind of murder that an intelligent woman might commit, one that relied on psychology rather than passion, on understanding human nature rather than on the crude application of force. But it was not perfect, because Hercule Poirot, that small Belgian gentleman with his love of order and his passion for the logical arrangement of facts, had perceived the inconsistencies, the locked room that was not quite as secure as it seemed, the incomplete letter that spoke of interruption, the glass that did not contain a sufficient quantity of poison, the night porter's observation of a woman departing the study in a state of agitation. And Lady Cray had made one more mistake. She had been too clever in her manipulation of events. She had arranged for the investigation into her husband's finances to occur, not realizing that this investigation would itself become evidence. She had altered the will, not realizing that this alteration would provide a clear motive for her action. She had staged the suicide scene too perfectly, not understanding that perfect staging is itself suspicious, because perfect staging suggests the hand of someone with time and knowledge to arrange all the details precisely. And so, Poirot murmured to himself, the pattern emerges. The loose threads gather themselves together and form a rope that leads inexorably to the perpetrator. It is, as always, a matter of understanding human nature, of recognizing that behind every action lies motive, and that behind every motive lies the fundamental human desires: survival, security, and the need for control. By morning, his preparations were complete. The gathering in the drawing-room of Shepherd's Hotel took place at 2:30 in the afternoon, at a time when the worst of the Cairo heat had passed, and the light had taken on a quality of golden softness. Poirot had requested the presence of Sir Oswald's immediate family, the household staff who had been on duty during the night of the death, several witnesses from the hotel, and the local authorities responsible for investigating the death. The Egyptian police inspector, a man named Malik, who possessed considerably more intelligence than he generally revealed, sat with an expression of patient skepticism. He had already concluded the case to be suicide, and he regarded this gathering as an indulgence of the eccentric Belgian gentleman who had proven useful in previous Cairo mysteries. "I have asked you to gather," Poirot began, "because I have come to a conclusion regarding the death of Sir Oswald Grey. This conclusion differs from the official determination of suicide, and because I believe that justice demands a full accounting of events, I have asked Inspector Malik to permit me to lay out the evidence that supports this alternative conclusion." "You have evidence that my husband did not take his own life?" Lady Grey asked, her voice steady and cool. "I have evidence," Poirot said, "that Sir Oswald Grey was murdered. Murdered with calculated premeditation by someone who knew him intimately, who understood his habits and his psychology, and who had both motive and opportunity to accomplish the deed." A silence fell upon the room. Edward moved to stand near the window, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Miriam gripped her drawing materials as though they were a lifeline. "The murder," Poirot continued, "was staged to appear as suicide. Considerable care was taken to create this appearance. A locked room, a glass containing a residue of poison, an incomplete letter suggesting despair. But the perpetrator made certain miscalculations. First, the quantity of poison in the glass was insufficient to have caused death. This suggests that the poison was administered elsewhere, in some other drink, and the glass was placed in the study as part of the staging after Sir Oswald was already dead." He paused, allowing this to settle. "Second, the incomplete letter bore signs of forgery. The handwriting degraded not because Sir Oswald's hand was failing due to the effects of poison, but because the forger's concentration was waning. This letter was completed by someone other than the man who began it." "How can you possibly know such a thing?" Lady Grey demanded. "Because I have examined the letter with a magnifying glass," Poirot explained, "and I have consulted with a handwriting expert. The conclusion is inescapable. The final portion of the letter was written by a different hand, an imitation rather than the original." "Then whoever wrote the letter is the murderer," Victor Sanderson exclaimed. "Precisely," Poirot agreed. "The murderer is the person who stood to gain most from Sir Oswald's death, and who possessed the motive, knowledge, and opportunity to accomplish it." He turned to face Lady Grey directly. "Some 6 months ago," he said, "you retained a private investigator to examine your husband's financial affairs. You did this ostensibly to satisfy your own curiosity, but in truth, you did it because you had begun to suspect that your husband's wealth was not as secure as you had believed when you married him. You discovered through this investigation that Sir Oswald was, in fact, living on capital, burning through his resources at an alarming rate. You realized that your position as his wife was precarious, and that if his financial situation became generally known, your husband might alter his will in a manner less favorable to you. I did nothing of the sort, Lady Crace said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. You obtained strychnine, Poirot continued, from a source in Cairo that deals in such substances to those who have the means to purchase them, and the discretion to ask few questions. You administered this poison to your husband in some drink. Perhaps a nightcap offered innocently. Perhaps something more elaborate. You waited for the poison to take effect, ensuring that you were not present when he died. You then returned to the study. The door was not locked, as has been assumed, but rather the mechanism of locking was accomplished after his death by your own hand. You completed the suicide note, your imitation of his handwriting being close enough to deceive a casual examination. You arranged the glass and the bottle to create the appearance of a man who had attempted to poison himself. This is absurd speculation, Lady Cray declared, but her face had become very pale. It is not speculation, Poirot said quietly. It is deduction based on evidence. The night porter observed you departing from the study at 11 o'clock. Your face bearing an expression he described as agitated but controlled. A woman emerging from her dying husband's presence might indeed be expected to display such an expression. The servants heard voices at 9 o'clock. 2 voices in conversation. One voice was your husband's, the other was yours. You were discussing the matter that had troubled him. The investigation into his finances, perhaps. Or perhaps you were discussing the alteration of his will. Whatever the nature of the conversation, it concluded with you offering him a drink, and him consuming the poison. Edward had moved closer, his face showing confusion and rage in equal measure. You are accusing my stepmother of murdering my father. I am doing more than accusing, Poirot said. I am demonstrating the method by which the murder was accomplished and the motive that propelled it. Lady Cray stood to inherit approximately £50,000 under the will that her husband had recently altered in her favour. Without that inheritance, she faced a future of diminished circumstances. No longer the wife of a wealthy man, but the former wife of a man with questionable finances and uncertain prospects. This prospect was intolerable to her, and so she acted. You cannot possibly prove any of this, Lady Cray said, her control beginning to crack. You have no evidence, only theories and suppositions. I have evidence enough, Poirot replied, to lay the matter before the proper authorities. The handwriting expert can attest to the forgery in the letter. The private investigator can testify that he was retained by you, not by some anonymous party. The servants can confirm the time at which you departed from the study, and the residue in the glass can be compared with a sample of poison obtained from the source from which you purchased it. Hassan has already identified that source, and the proprietor has agreed to cooperate with the authorities. It was at this moment that Lady Cray's composure finally shattered. She rose from her chair, her face contorted with emotion. "He deserved it!" she cried. "Do you understand? He deserved it. I gave him everything. I was young and beautiful, and I married a man 25 years my senior. I endured his coldness, his emotional absence, his obsession with his dead past. And then he began to lose interest in me, to look at other women, to make it clear that he was weary of his wife. He was going to cut me off. He was going to reduce my allowance, alter his will, cast me aside like a worn-out garment. Perhaps, Poirot said gently, He was simply a man growing old and wondering if he had been wise in his choices. But that is no justification for ending his life. He was a tyrant, Lady Cray screamed. He controlled everyone around him. His first wife, his children, everyone. He destroyed his son's dreams because Edward would not conform to his expectations. He turned his daughter against him. He treated his servants like machines. And when he became bored with me, when he realized he had made a mistake in marrying me, he simply decided to cast me aside. And so you poisoned him, Poirot said. You murdered him out of rage and desperation, and the conviction that you had been wronged. And in doing so, you have committed not merely murder, but the most terrible of all murders, the cold, calculated killing of a man who had made the mistake of loving you. However inadequately, the next moments descended into chaos. Lady Cray made a sudden movement toward the window, but Colonel Hastings and the Egyptian police moved swiftly to restrain her. She did not resist, but instead collapsed into a kind of vacant despair, as though she had suddenly become aware of the true weight of what she had done. "Take her away," Inspector Mallock said to his subordinates, and Lady Cray was removed, still murmuring her justifications, her reasons, her convictions that she had been wronged, and had merely balanced the scales of justice according to her own understanding. The matter was concluded with the efficiency that modern police work, when properly motivated, can achieve. Lady Cray was formally charged with the murder of Sir Oswald Cray. She confessed to the crime, providing details that corroborated every aspect of Poirot's analysis. The trial was brief and proceeded according to the legal protocols of Egypt. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence was severe. But the true matter of importance was not the legal conclusion. It was rather the reckoning that had to occur within the family that had been so dramatically torn asunder. Edward spent a long afternoon with Poirot in the Belgian gentleman's hotel room, attempting to understand how his father's death had come about and what it meant for his own future. "I was angry with him," Edward said, his voice hollow with regret, "and I came to Cairo prepared to confront him, to demand accountability for his treatment of me, for his theft of my ambitions and his substitution of his own expectations in their place. And I find that he was murdered before I had the opportunity to say any of the things I had prepared to say. I find that I must now go through life without ever having achieved reconciliation with him." "Perhaps that is for the best," Poirot said gently. "Reconciliation that must be forced is rarely true reconciliation. Your father was a difficult man, and he was not inclined to change. The conflict between you was genuine and perhaps ultimately irreconcilable. But you have the opportunity now to live your own life according to your own principles. That is a gift that many men do not receive." "A gift purchased with his blood," Edward said bitterly. "A gift purchased with his foolishness in choosing as a wife a woman whose character he did not understand," Poirot corrected. "He was not a victim of injustice, Edward. He was a victim of his own inability to comprehend the hearts of those around him." Miriam found solace in Dr. Pemberton, who attended her during the difficult days following her stepmother's arrest. The young woman had lost her father, lost her security, lost the family constellation in which she had lived her entire life. But she had gained in exchange the freedom to make her own choices. "I shall study art formally," she told Poirot when she came to bid him farewell. "Dr. Pemberton has encouraged me to pursue my drawing seriously, and perhaps in time we shall marry. It is not the life my father would have chosen for me, but it is the life I choose for myself, and for that I am grateful." Your father might have come to understand, Poirot suggested. Given time, given patience, given a willingness on your part to persist in your choices. Fathers, even difficult ones, sometimes learn. But you were not given the opportunity to discover this. Still, you have seized the freedom that has come to you, and that is admirable. Captain Hastings and Poirot took their final evening meal together on the terrace of Shepherd's Hotel, watching the sun descend over Cairo in a cascade of gold and crimson. Well, Hastings said, it is all concluded. Justice has been served. The guilty have been punished, and the innocent, or at least the less guilty, are left to rebuild their lives as best they can. Yes, Poirot agreed, though I confess I find the notion of justice to be somewhat complicated by the complexity of human nature. Lady Cray was guilty of murder, certainly, but was she guilty in the sense of being a monstrous aberration? Or was she merely a woman who was wounded and desperate, and who made a terrible choice? I do not know. I know only that she killed a man, and that this killing has resulted in harm to all who were connected to him. Whether the world is better or worse for the exchange, I cannot say. You are growing philosophical in your old age, Hastings observed with a smile. I am growing wise in my old age, Poirot corrected without irony. And wisdom consists, I have found, in understanding that evil is often not the product of monstrosity, but of desperation. This does not excuse the evil, you understand, but it complicates our judgment of it. And if our judgment is complicated, perhaps we are less likely to commit the same errors ourselves. They sat in companionable silence as the Egyptian night descended, bringing with it all the familiar sounds and scents of Cairo. Somewhere in the distance, a muezzin called the faithful to prayer. The Nile rustled softly in the darkness. The eternal city pursued its eternal business, indifferent to the dramas that had been played out within its confines. I think, Poirot said finally, that we should return to Europe. The Cairo season has lost its charm, and the little grey cells have been sufficiently exercised by the mysteries of this place. I have a craving for the order of civilization, for the precision of European winter, for a decent Belgian chocolate and a properly waxed moustache. 3 weeks later, Hercule Poirot sat in his London flat, in a comfortable chair positioned before a satisfying fire. The case of Sir Oswald Cray's murder had concluded. The guilty had been punished, and the matter had passed from the public consciousness into the realm of history. Only Poirot retained the full memory of all that had occurred, and he did not share this memory lightly. He was eating a small piece of Belgian chocolate and reflecting upon the curious ways of human nature when his friend and chronicler, Captain Hastings, was admitted to his presence. "Well, my dear Hastings," Poirot greeted him, "you find me in a state of considerable satisfaction. The order has been restored. The chaos has been reduced to reason, and I have had the opportunity to verify once again that the human heart is an inexhaustible source of both tragedy and comedy." "You have been reflecting on the Cairo case?" Hastings asked, settling into the chair across from him. "I have been reflecting," Poirot said, "on the curious fact that we English, and I include myself in this category, though technically I am Belgian, seem to believe that order. Propriety and civilized restraint are the highest virtues. And yet, when these virtues are maintained to an extreme degree, they often contain within them the seeds of their own destruction. Sir Oswald Cray maintained perfect control over his emotions, perfect order in his household, perfect adherence to propriety, and yet this perfection was purchased at the cost of connection, of genuine feeling, of authentic human relationship. And when the strain became too great, when someone close to him began to crack under the weight of that emotional repression, The result was murder. You are suggesting that Sir Oswald was responsible, in a sense, for his own death? Hastings asked. I am suggesting that we are all responsible in some degree for the consequences of our character, Poirot replied. Sir Oswald chose to be a man of absolute control and absolute emotional distance. This choice had consequences. One of those consequences was the murder of Sir Oswald Grey. Hastings pondered this for a moment. Then there is a moral to this tale? There is always a moral, Poirot said, a smile playing about his lips. The moral is that life is complex, that justice is never simple, and that the pursuit of absolute order often results in the creation of absolute chaos. It is also, if you will permit me a final observation, that the little grey cells are most valuable when they are employed not merely to discover truth, but to understand it in all its complexity and difficulty. He took another piece of chocolate and settled back in his chair. The matter concluded, the order restored, the chaos reduced to pattern and comprehensibility. Outside, London carried on in its orderly, English way, entirely unaware of the mysteries that had been solved in distant Cairo, the murders that had been avenged, and the strange wisdom that resided in the magnificent Belgian gentleman who had, once again, brought reason and order to a world that seemed increasingly inclined toward confusion and disorder. And that, truly, was all that Hercule Poirot could ask.